In the summer of 1518, hundreds of people in one European city danced themselves to death. They danced on bloodied feet in cobblestone streets. They danced in the heat of midsummer until they collapsed. The disease is well documented. The deaths are well documented. The dancers themselves are well documented. What is harder to explain is that the man writing it all down had spent the previous 20 years warning Europe that exactly this would happen. And he could not stop it. This is The Fallen Kingdom, the channel where every century gives up its secrets. Today we're in Strasbourg. In the summer, the city tried to cure a plague by making it worse. Subscribe and you won't miss what we uncover next. Strasbourg, in the summer of 1518, was a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire. Its own laws, its own taxes, its own council. 20,000 people lived inside the walls. The cathedral spire, finished 79 years earlier, was the tallest in Christendom, visible from miles before the city itself came into view. On paper, the city was prosperous. Inside the walls, the people were dying. The harvests of 1516 and 1517 had failed. Bread cost more than most families earned. Smallpox had come and gone and come back. Syphilis, a disease Europe was only just beginning to recognize, was moving through the lower districts. And in the cathedral, the sermons that summer were turning to a familiar theme: divine punishment, the wrath of God on a sinful city. By July, the city was a body under sustained pressure, hungry, sick, watching for the next sign. And then on a Sunday morning in the middle of July, a woman walked out of her front door and into the street. Her name was Frau Trophia. We know almost nothing else about her. She was working class, she was married. She lived in one of the lower districts of a city that had been starving for 3 years. On the 14th of July 1518, she walked into the cobblestone street outside her half-timbered home, and she began to dance. There was no music, there was no festival, there was no celebration she had been preparing for. Her husband begged her to stop. She did not stop. She did not seem to hear him. She danced until the sky turned black and she collapsed in a twitching heap of exhaustion. She slept where she fell. And the next morning, before she had eaten or drunk anything, she stood up and she danced again. By the third day, her shoes had worn through. By the fourth, her feet were bleeding. By the sixth, she had not stopped for more than a few hours of collapsed sleep, and her neighbors were beginning to gather in the street to watch. Within a week, more than 30 other people had joined her. Within a month, that number reached 400. And here is the part the chronicles are very clear about. The dancers were not enjoying themselves. They wept, they screamed, they begged the people around them to make them stop, and no one could. Not the priests, not the families, not the dancers themselves. And so the city's physicians were called in, and what they prescribed would make everything worse. The doctors of Strasbourg, working from the medical theory available to them, the same theory that had governed European medicine for 1300 years, diagnosed the dancers with an excess of hot blood. Galenic theory: the body was governed by 4 humors, and an imbalance in any one of them produced illness. Too much hot blood produced fever, mania, frenzied, uncontrolled motion. And the cure for too much hot blood, the doctors explained, was to let it out, to purge the heat through vigorous movement. The cure for compulsive dancing, the doctors said, was more dancing. And the council agreed. They cleared the guild halls. They built a wooden platform in the horse market. They hired professional musicians, drummers, fife players, pipers, to play day and night. They hired healthy dancers to encourage the afflicted, believing that vigorous movement would purge the disease from the city. They were trying to help. They genuinely believed they were helping. The stage drew crowds, the crowds drew watchers, and the watchers, already hungry, already terrified, already half convinced that God was punishing their city, began to dance themselves. The cure was the engine of the disease. Some collapsed from heart failure, some from exhaustion, some from the simple fact that they had not eaten or drunk anything for days. The wood of the stage darkened where the bloodied feet had been. Somewhere in the city, in a chamber not far from the horse market, the city's clerk was recording it. "A terrible disease has spread," he wrote, "so that around 50 people dance day and night, which is painful to see." That early in August, the count was around 50. Within weeks, it would reach 400. We will come back to him. 6 weeks in, the council finally understood what they had done. On the 28th of August, 1518, the Council of Strasbourg issued a series of ordinances. They reversed everything. All public dancing was banned, all public music was banned. The wooden stages were ordered torn down, and one specific exception was written into the law that tells you exactly what they had finally figured out. Families could play stringed instruments at weddings. They were forbidden to use tambourines or drums. The council had figured out that percussion was the trigger. Drums, dancers, watchers, a stage, and before all of it, a woman in an empty street. The man holding the quill was the Chancellor of Strasbourg. His name was Sebastian Brandt. He was 61 years old. He had served the city for 17 years, and 24 years before he sat down to write that ordinance, he had published the most widely read book in Europe, The Ship of Fools, an allegory about humans rushing collectively into folly, about entire societies boarding a ship that was visibly sinking because no one on board could see what was happening to them. It was translated into Latin, French, English, Dutch within a decade. Albrecht Dürer illustrated it. Erasmus read it. It was the book that defined the diagnosis of collective folly for an entire generation of Europe. And in the book itself, Brandt had been even more specific. He had written that dance and sin were the same thing. He had warned in print that this was how a city lost itself. And in the summer of 1518, he watched it happen in his own streets, and he could not stop it until people had been dying for 6 weeks. The remaining dancers were taken on pilgrimage to a shrine of St. Vitus in the hills near Saverne. They were given red shoes for their bloodied feet. A priest traced the cross with holy oil. They were sprinkled with holy water in the saint's name. And the dancing slowly ended, possibly because the priests stopped the music, possibly because the mania had simply burned through everyone susceptible to it. We don't know. But we know who recorded it, and we know what he had warned 24 years earlier was coming for all of us. Here is what we usually get wrong about the dancing plague. We treat it as a medical mystery. We ask, was it ergot poisoning? Was it spirit possession? Was it mass psychogenic illness brought on by famine and stress? And the honest answer is, historians have largely settled this. John Waller and a generation of medical historians after him have made a strong case that this was mass psychogenic illness in a population primed by hunger and saturated in a religious belief that gave the suffering a shape. The dancers believed St. Vitus could curse them with this affliction. Their bodies obliged. That's the question that gets answered. But it isn't the question that haunts. The question that haunts is what the city did. A hungry, exhausted population began to dance, and the men in charge of that city, the doctors trained in the best medical theory of their century, the magistrates working from the best civic logic available to them, decided the cure for compulsive dancing was a stage, and musicians, and paid encouragement. They were not stupid, they were not cruel. They were working from the best knowledge their century had, and that knowledge was catastrophically wrong. And the man who recorded all of this, the man who drafted the ordinance that finally stopped the music, was the same man who, 24 years earlier, had written Europe's most famous book about exactly this kind of folly. He had published the diagnosis, he had named the disease, and he was still 6 weeks too late. The Dancing Plague is not a story about why they danced. It is a story about what authority does when it cannot understand what is happening to its people. And 500 years later, that question is not antique. So that's our case for the strangest summer of the 16th century. And the question I want to leave you with is this. Did Brandt recognize his own thesis playing out in his streets? Or did he, like everyone else, only understand what was happening when it was already over? Drop your theory in the comments, we read every single one. Smash the like button if this one kept you watching, and hit subscribe so you're here when the next case drops. This is the Fallen Kingdom, and every century has its secrets.